Hello South Africa, and welcome to this special edition of Coronacast, your twice weekly information show, keeping you up to date with the latest happenings around the COVID-19 crisis in South Africa and our response to it. I'd like to start off this show today on a sad note, and that's to express our deepest condolences to the friends and family and loved ones of struggle stalwart Dennis Goldberg, who tragically passed away yesterday evening. Dennis Goldberg was one of the Rivonia trialists. He spent over 22 years in jail, and we owe him a huge debt of gratitude as South Africans, and the democracy and the freedoms we enjoy today are because of the sacrifice and struggle of people like Dennis Goldberg. We extend our sympathies to his family and friends, as well as his political organization, on his passing. Also start today's show very disappointed, as I'm sure many South Africans woke up this morning feeling that same sense of disappointment after the announcements yesterday evening by government on what level 4 of the lockdown is going to look like. On the initial look at it, it certainly doesn't look much different to level 5, except with obviously the exercise allowed for 3 hours in the morning and a military curfew in the evenings. We made some significant input into this particular set of regulations, and we're obviously disappointed that very few of those have been heeded. Unfortunately, level 4 in terms of the regulations announced last night are a blunt instrument and not nearly deft enough to be able to open up the economy in a way that will protect both lives and livelihoods. We believe that, as it's set out in our document in response to the original regulations, that there should have been an incentive-driven approach that bases its approach on trusting South Africans. I think it's very interesting that the Human Sciences Research Council released a report which showed the massively high degree of buy-in and compliance with the regulations in terms of the lockdown. One would have thought that this would have encouraged government to incentivize South Africans by showing them some trust. Instead, we seem to have been a hardening of the approach as we head into the level 4 of the lockdown. One of the big surprises yesterday evening, no doubt, and again showing some of the draconian and unnecessary natures of this, was the about turn on the sale of tobacco. A few days ago, the President of the Republic of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, was on television and indicated that tobacco sales would proceed under level 4, and yet last night Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the Minister of Cogta, announced that in fact tobacco sales would still be prohibited. This doesn't make much sense on an economic and a health perspective. If the Minister thinks, for instance, that South Africans who smoke are not still smoking, then I'm afraid she is not grounded in reality. What has happened is that the cigarette and tobacco trade has been pushed completely underground. And so the only beneficiaries of this continued ban on tobacco are those people who have ties or are involved with the illicit cigarette trade in South Africa. The South African government, SARS and customs have spent huge amounts of money and energy over the course of the last 2 decades clamping down hard on the illegal cigarette manufacturers and the illegal distribution networks in the country. They are the only winners in this situation. The big loser, of course, is the people of South Africa, because in both the legal cigarette trade, the sin tax element that involved goes directly into government coffers. That money is used then for social services, for capital expenditure, and providing health care to ordinary South Africans. By pushing this trade underground, what government has done is forgone billions of rands in terms of revenue and instead opened up a huge incentive for a black market trade for which nobody will benefit other than that underground mafia and the cadres that are connected to them. Our approach that we tabled incentivizes businesses and individuals to comply with the regulations going forward, in reward for that, to be able to open up workplaces to protect lives and livelihoods going forward. Some of the regulations as well are just simply irrational. And while we welcome the fact that people can exercise, it simply doesn't make sense that that has been limited to 3 hours in the morning. Some people have to work during that time, but also from a health perspective, it certainly doesn't make sense to get every South African who wants to exercise out onto, in that narrow time break, onto the streets where they're likely to bump into each other, to be running past each other and the like. I think this is one of the regulations that certainly doesn't make much sense. And surely when one balances the regulations and the criteria being used to assess those regulations, it has to be measured against what is its efficacy in combating the spread of the virus going forward. Some of the regulations announced last night simply don't do that. One also gets a sense that the call for public comment was a box-ticking exercise, and we'll delve a bit further into that later in the show. But it's certainly, there's no conceivable way that government was able to go through the over 70,000 submissions that they received in a day and a half, and to give them proper consideration. Other restrictions, like the ban on alcohol, while while maybe being argued from a health perspective, also don't make sense from a economic perspective, and again are going to open up a huge trade in illegal liquor, but also the brewing of liquor in homes in an unregulated way that could actually lead to far more dangerous health response outcomes if people are brewing their own liquor without supervision and without the knowledge and expertise and regulation to be able to guide them. We already know there's huge amounts of sorghum beer, pineapple beer, and other forms of alcohol, ale and the like, that is being brewed all over the country and distributed. It would certainly have made a lot more sense, as we suggested in our smart lockdown model at this phase 4, to open up at limited times liquor stores for people to be able to buy liquor. That way you're making sure that the alcohol people are getting is regulated, it is safe, and that you're not helping the burgeoning of an illegal trade. But the common thread that runs through all these regulations that we saw last night is government's fundamental lack of trust in the people of South Africa. We're being treated like children rather than adults, and that is very, very disappointing. We need to be able to trust our citizens with some degree of personal responsibility. And perhaps what demonstrates this lack of trust better than anything else is this military curfew that has again now been enforced from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. It seems to me that there are some people who are indulging in their fantasies of an authoritarian state, a centrally planned economy, and are using the virus to be able to bring their dreams of these things to pass in South Africa. We need to make very, very clear that as the Democratic Alliance and the official opposition in the country, whilst we support the fight against COVID-19, we support the lockdown model, we've been very supportive of the President's efforts to date, what was announced last night has the real potential to undermine the compact and consensus between the government and the people of South Africa. Everybody understands why we need to have regulations in place. Everybody understands how important it is for us to beat the virus and to manage the virus going forward. But when regulations descend into pettiness, the number of kilometers you can run, what you can drink, what you can smoke, when you can do so, it starts to unstitch that consensus upon which a successful managed lockdown requires. It needs the buy-in from citizens. International experience has shown us, and we've spoken through some of those examples here, that when you get a bottom-up buy-in and consensus, you're sharing the data, you're treating people as adults, you're explaining why decisions are being made, and decisions are not made in an arbitrary way, you get far bigger buy-in. It's for that reason that other countries in the world have not banned alcohol or cigarettes during this particular period. They've allowed limited exercise. South Africa remains the only country where a tobacco ban and an alcohol ban has remained in a slightly alleviated lockdown. And I think there's a lot of questions as to why that is the case and why it should be happening. We also know that we will be approaching the courts on the issue of the use of BE criteria for aid relief in South Africa. I want to differentiate our case from that of the AfriForum and Solidarity case, in which judgment was handed down. We believe that case is far too narrow, and what we are going to be attacking through a legal challenge is whether in a disaster situation, in a disaster management environment, whether any form of discrimination, whether it be on gender, whether it be on race, whether it be on geography, is permitted. And we look forward to the court pronouncing on that. This is going to be very, very important going forward. And so today we will be filing papers in the Western Cape High Court, and we will be challenging the decision made by not only the small business minister. We're not focusing on any particular ministry. We're focusing on the concept as a whole, which we believe needs to get some legal clarity. Well, I'm going to hand over now to the panel that I have with me today to discuss the regulations in this special edition as we unpack the level 4 lockdown regulations as they were released this evening. I'm joined in studio today by Dean Macpherson, our trade and industry spokesperson, who's been at the forefront of crafting our response to the regulations, our health spokesperson and Shadow Minister of Health, Siviwe Gwarube, to talk a little bit about some of the questions around Western Cape testing and the health response on the virus, and Gwen and Ngwenya, the DA's head of the policy unit, which has been completely repurposed during this crisis to be coming up with ideas and getting evidence together to back up the submissions that we've made. Gwen has played an integral role in informing the DA's response in this particular time, and we're very proud to have staff members in our operation of her caliber. Right, well, let's move over then. I'm going to start with you, Dean, on trade and industry. Now, you and Gwen and the rest of the team basically stayed up all night once the regulations were published to make sure that we had a submission going in. You're no doubt disappointed by what you saw last night.
Yeah, John, I mean, I think what we've seen is these regulations are nothing other than level 5 regulations in running shorts, to be honest. There's been very little difference between the focus on the economy in level 5 and level 4. We've seen slight increases in the allowance of manufacturing, but we've seen a continued unwillingness to move on things like e-commerce, and that just doesn't make sense, because we know that e-commerce is a real opportunity to get goods into people's homes while stopping them from going into stores and therefore delaying the transmission of the virus. And so there seems to be a continued ideological battle in cabinet over the use of e-commerce around the idea of fairness and what is and isn't fair. And quite frankly, that's not up to a single minister or even the cabinet to decide on fairness in the economy. That is left up to other institutions like the Competition Commission. And we think that they've really missed a big opportunity to allow businesses that can contribute to the economic recovery, that have a role to play, that can meet minimum health criteria to do so. And I think that really it's been a huge disappointment for small business owners and also business owners of big business that employ large amounts of people. And they're really scratching their head and wondering how they're going to make it through this next period. But also brings into question the real meaningfulness of the engagement around the 70,000 submissions. Minister Dlamini Zuma seemed to highlight and relish the 2,000 objections that were sent to the sale of tobacco, but neither Minister Patel or her made any mention of the strong support by tens of thousands of South Africans to get their sectors of the economy going, and that is a real problem.
Let me just stop you here with this e-commerce one, because this is the one I just can't get my head around. Surely in an environment where you're wanting to discourage people from congregating at shopping centres, from swiping credit cards, exchanging money, e-commerce makes sense on so many levels. It's relatively easy in the current context where nothing is really easy. for a business to be able to move its product services online and offer a delivery service and therefore open up that section of the economy. What is government's attack on e-commerce all about?
Well, it comes down to their interpretation of what is fair. And their argument is that, well, if a spaza shop can't be open and sell goods online, then other retail outlets can't. And
but spaza shops are open.
Exactly, and that's the real problem that Minister Patel finds himself in. Yesterday, Reuters released an article that said 50% of South Africans make use of e-commerce in one way or another. Now, it's not fair to deny 50% of the country the opportunity to get the goods into their home that they want to, so that they don't have to go into store. And we know that one of government's key criteria in determining which sectors should or shouldn't be open is the ability to delay the transmission of the virus. Now, e-commerce is that very answer and solution, and yet they choose not to do so. I was looking at some statistics coming out of Amazon, and they have seen a real boom in their business and are in fact actually employing 100,000 people as a result of the surge and demand for e-commerce. So it just makes no sense, none whatsoever. There is no rational reason why South Africa is not embracing e-commerce to the full extent that it should be.
Yeah, thanks. And then just in terms of, it's getting a lot of it coming through Olga, Michelle, others here. This thing around hair and beauty. I mean, the minister said last night, well, South Africans must just cut and do their own hair and they must watch online tutorials.
Yeah.
The reality is far different. We're talking about a big industry here, and an industry that straddles a wide, sort of demographic. You've got township barbers, you've got street side barbers, you've got hairdressers, you've got grooming salons. This looks like this industry is going to be wiped out until stage 1, which could be 8 to 10 months away. How does somebody sustain a business over that period?
Well, John, I mean, we keep talking about this issue because I think it is such a crystallization of how wrong government gets the levels and the participation by certain sectors. Hairdressers and barbers are found in every community, from rich to working class to poor to informal and formal. They are found everywhere, and particularly in working class communities, those hairdressers and barbers run out of their homes, out of their garages, and eke out a living to support their family. Now, to believe that they should be in level 1 is completely unacceptable, and dismisses the livelihoods of tens of thousands of people across this country. And just to expect people just to go online and learn how to cut their hair is just not a good enough response. And we think that if there's a real industry that can institute health protocols to a maximum benefit, it is in the beauty care, personal services is what we call it, because it's on a one-on-one basis. You can have masks, you can have gloves, you can sanitize on entry and exit, and so I really, really feel that this is going to have devastating consequences for thousands of working class people across this country.
I mean, it makes sense that any business that can actually, practice those 3 key things: social distancing, use of PPE, and being able to do screening, should be allowed to open up in some way.
Well, the key foundation of our submission, John, is one based on trust, and one based on sectoral health standards for each level between that sector and government. And there are different sectors that require different healthcare protocols, and if you can meet that agreeable protocol for that sector, you should be allowed to open. It is not our job, not as political parties, not as government, to pick winners and losers in an economy where everyone has something to contribute. That is the bottom line. Every business, big and small, has something to contribute. If you can meet those levels in level 4, you should be allowed to be open. You may well decide as your business that it's too costly or not desirable to meet those conditions, and so therefore you will wait until a later stage. That's totally up to you.
And there are some businesses that wouldn't be able to open. It's like a restaurant, for instance.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't be able to have a situation where you've got people sitting around tables.
Absolutely.
But you could repurpose that business.
Of course. I mean, if you look at some hotel accommodation, if they could meet certain criteria, and that may be very limited, like only have 20% occupancy, but you can meet the minimum criteria, you should be able to be open. So we should not be saying this sector and a subsector in that sector can be open. And what's even worse is to start picking products in those sectors to be open. We cannot play a role of determining what people can and cannot buy. It is vehemently opposed to our freedom of choices, and we should be protecting that right and protecting people's rights to make a living in this economy.
Before I go over to Siviwe, I want to talk to you about manufacturing. Now, we've seen manufacturing on a downward decline over the course of the year, even prior to the COVID virus's arrival on our shores. Manufacturing was in trouble. Some of the manufacturing regulations here say just don't make sense from a practical perspective. And it looks to me like very few people in government have actually grappled with what does manufacturing look like and how manufacturing works. So, for instance, opening up 20% of a factory. It's just not possible. I mean, what are your views on that?
Well, one of the submissions that we had made is, that manufacturing should be able to open, no matter what sector it is, again, as long as it meets health protocols. What government's done has upped the overall manufacturing ability to open from 20 to 30%. But for me, that just shows the complete lack of understanding in manufacturing, that it is a highly sophisticated industry that has value chains and supply chains that span the globe and are across the country. And you simply cannot just open a percentage of a business or have a percentage of workers on that line. There are a couple of people that may be required to run one machine, and there may be multiple machines required to run a line. So you can't just pick and choose what line you want to open. So I think that they've got it dead wrong, and I think that that's going to cause even further hardship in the manufacturing sector when we actually needed to produce goods down the line that will be used once the economy is more open.
Sure. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to it because there's lots of questions coming through, and please keep those questions coming through. Siviwe, let's deal with the big elephant in the room. Spike in the Western Cape. I see that there's some attempts by certain political parties and I think a little bit of disingenuousness from some of the stats that are coming out and the way it's been interpreted, trying to say, well, the Western Cape, is doing something wrong because you've suddenly seen a spike in figures. But that's not the case. Do you want to take us through why we've seen a spike in the Western Cape and what the strategy is?
Yeah. So thanks, John. I think what's important is to understand why transparency in data is very important in a pandemic like this. We have for the past 7 weeks been adamant that government must at all times be transparent with South Africans about what data they're looking at, what models are they looking at, what projections are they looking at. Now, with this risk-adjusted strategy, actually that's become far more important because how government moves from level 4 to level 5 or from the other way around is actually premised and firmly grounded on the models that they're looking at and also the stats that they're looking at. So never has it been so important for those stats to be accurate, for those stats to be uniform, and for those stats to be credible. And so it's still a frustration of ours that even with the technical briefing that the minister had earlier this week, it was anything but, where we were expecting to see at the very least an updated model, because now we've had 5 weeks of a lockdown, and it would be expected that government has at least behind it a lot of data now to be able to see where the trends are going. And obviously we've seen in the portfolio committee him sharing some of the graphs that they're looking at and what the behavior of the pandemic is, and all of that is appreciated, but we've got to understand on what basis are you making certain decisions. So on what model are you basing this? If you're building field hospitals, why are you doing that? Is it because we are anticipating 40 to 45,000 deaths in 1 year? And trust your citizens to be able to handle that information so that they can understand why you restrict certain things, why you institute certain things, because it's important for accountability and also for buy-in.
Yeah. I think that's an important point. I want to stop you there because that's the thing that really struck me last night. I thought a lot of the regulations were really sort of mean-spirited that you'd expect from a government who had got no cooperation to date from the citizens. I think our citizens have been absolutely remarkable in cooperation, not across the board, but certainly by far the intense majority of them have abided by the regulations. And surely what you do to get by is to trust your citizens. Give us the data. Treat us like adults. Let us be able to help you make decisions. And knowledge is power in this instance.
Absolutely, and South Africans are partners in this. So it's not a parent-child relationship.
Felt like that last night, I must be honest.
It's not a parent-child relationship. So it's important that the government understands that citizens are partners in dealing with the pandemic. So when you're dealing with a partner, you say, look, this is what we're looking at, and we are worried about the winter peak that is coming up in the winter months. As a result, that's why we have to make sure that level 4 looks like this, or this is why certain areas or metros will remain in the red. What does that mean? Does that mean because some of these hot pockets of our metros are red, doesn't that mean that we're going to be in level 5? It's still unclear, because that's where most of the economy is situated. So this is where that's what we've been trying to communicate to the minister and his team, that to show us a model is not to show things that should be somehow hidden from South Africans. It is to get yourself buy-in from South Africans as they have. But just to your point about the Western Cape, I think it has been slightly disappointing to see some political parties try and unravel the sense of cooperation we've had in the country over the past 7 weeks. I think we've seen an unprecedented level of cooperation across the board. I think political parties have understood and respected that this is a matter of life and death, and nobody has politicized this. And so it has been disappointing to see now, some kind of politicization coming across. But I think it's important, John, to clarify what it is that the Western Cape is doing. And in fact, instead of punishing them, we need to, in fact, applaud them for the kind of work that they're doing in trying to combat this pandemic. So the Western Cape has a 4-step approach that they are following. So instead of doing random screening and testing in communities, so we launched the community screening test phase as a country about 6 weeks ago, and the idea was to send thousands of community healthcare workers in communities to go and find people, instead of having people who present with symptoms come to you in the health facilities. And the idea behind that was so that we can make sure that we are covering as many people as possible, and so that we can understand the true extent of community transmissions. But what the Western Cape has done over and above that is to identify what they call bushfires. So by that they mean clusters of infection. So if they've identified a couple of people in a community who've tested positive, it then obviously makes sense that there would be a couple of more people in that community or in that cluster who would test positive. So instead of randomly going into communities door to door, what they're doing is they're targeting specifically areas where they believe that there could be a boom of the virus.
But can I just stop you there? Isn't that precisely what Professor Karim said we should be doing? I'm reminded here of that, of the slide he put up, precisely this, with the little bushfires,
Yes.
which he said you focus on putting
Yes.
out so before it becomes a big fire.
Exactly. So, and that's what the Western Cape has managed to do, and managed to do successfully. So the 4-part strategy is this, where people can self-screen. So those who have access to internet and can go into the government websites and answer some questions where you can be able to see whether or not you fit the criteria and go get yourself tested. That's the one thing. The second thing is the community screening effort by community healthcare workers. They have about 3,800 community healthcare workers in vulnerable communities, going to people in these bushfire scenarios where they're going to target people so that they can go and make sure that if you are presenting with symptoms, you are referred to a health facility. Then they also have facility screenings. They have erected about 320 sites across the province to encourage people to go and get tested. So not just your traditional sites or your traditional health facilities that you had before, but these are now special sites where it can be easier for you as an ordinary person on your way to work, or without having to go far, to go to a site and get tested. And then lastly, workplace screening. So the workplaces that have been identified as essential services, they're getting screened. They're sending teams in those workplaces to go and screen people, to go and test people. That's why they've been able to identify certain places and certain companies or factories where health protocols have not been followed, and they've shut those down, where employees have effectively been infected at work. And so that is an effective strategy, because you are killing it at the source. You are making sure that people are not endangered. If you, as a company, you are opening up for business, that you're not endangering lives. And so this strategy is a full-part strategy, which means that we are seeing over 30% of the total of tests that are being done in the country are coming from the Western Cape. And now that's a big number. If you
So it's basically 1 in 3 tests done in the country is done here in the Western Cape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's an important distinction to make. In fact, what we should be saying is that we should be emulating this example across the country, so that we can see more and more provinces doing this, targeting special areas, like in the Eastern Cape, for instance, in Port St. John's, where that funeral was. You see, a strategy like that would have been able to help the provincial government immediately be able to see the extent of the spread. So that is what is happening in the Western Cape. And obviously, I mean, like I said, it's not for anyone to politicize this matter, but we've got to be able to identify where strategies are working, and we've got to encourage that and say emulate that across the country.
I saw another figure as well. It said that 16% of the tests in the country have been done in the Western Cape, despite the fact it only has 10% of the population. So it shows that, I mean, it ties in exactly with strategy. Test.
Exactly.
The more testing you do, the better your data sets are, the more it informs how you move through and manage the virus.
And it informs your strategy, and then you're far more targeted in your approach, and as a result, you've got a better yield in results when you are testing in a targeted fashion, as opposed to a more generalized.
I'm going to bring Gwen in here, and Gwen's in Joburg, so she's doing proper social distancing all the way up there in Gauteng. But Gwen, thank you for making time again to join us here on Coronacast. I want to talk specifically around these issues around the curfew, around the tobacco and liquor, because, you know, from my side, it just makes absolutely no sense. Maybe one could understand it in a hard lockdown, although, you know, my internal philosophy speaks against the government telling me what I can and cannot drink. But certainly in a supposed lightened lockdown, why are we sitting with this situation? And why did the president lose the battle? He came out quite clearly last week to say tobacco was going to be allowed in level 4. Last night, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma stood up and completely blew that out the water.
Yeah, I mean, what I would want to add is just to look at why those issues that you raise red flags for us in particular. And I think from a policy perspective, we're always looking at a couple of things. So both in the submissions that we have put forward and what comes out of government, we're always looking to see that, one, any proposals or rules put forward are the product of evidence, if they're evidence-based. We want to see that there's a level of flexibility involved in the rulemaking. And I think it's important that we know that the proposals that we receive are not being driven purely by dogma, and that there's, especially in a situation like this with the coronavirus, that we are able to adjust to the changing circumstances. And thirdly, there's a high degree of transparency. And the reason transparency is so important is because that enables you to see whether there is a rational link or relationship between the rule or proposal that is being put forward and the problem that you are trying to address. So where rules are arbitrary, where they are absolute and driven purely by politics and not by the evidence, and thirdly, where they are opaque and we cannot actually have any oversight over them, they are far more likely to impinge on civil liberties and to impinge on our freedoms. So that's why these issues raise such red flags for us, because they violate almost all 3 principles. We cannot see the evidence that is backing the curfew and banning of certain products like tobacco. It is unclear that government is willing to be flexible and to adjust their position in light of best practice and evidence that has been put before them. And also, spectacularly, we have no oversight or transparency into the full process of decision-making the full process that was involved in them arriving at these decisions. So I think whenever you have a situation like this, it raises red flags for how that policy process has been conducted. And I think that's why, in terms of what we're actually going to do, we're so concerned to identify any legal gaps where we can challenge these decisions in court. And I think that's important to see what room we have in terms of the Disaster Management Act to challenge these draconian rules, and also perhaps to really put forward solutions, because I think whilst the court process is absolutely vital, it will help us to budge the government an inch. I think we also need to provide solutions and what we would do in its stead. I think there's no reason for me to go into detail about that, because I think Dean has outlined it. But what I can say, and what's quite clear about what we've proposed, is that there's a very rational relationship between how we think the levels of lockdown should look like and the problems that are being addressed. So we're quite clear that the driving or central problem or issue should be the level of transmission risk, and the government must be quite clear for each sector what the risks of transmission are, and then as a corollary to that, for every level to show that what is the risk mitigation steps that must be taken to address those particular risks. So if it's done in that fashion and it's transparent, it means it should also give businesses the opportunity to innovate and to propose their own solutions as to how they intend to mitigate any risk that is raised.
Gwen, let's deal with a bit of ideology here, because we've got a very different fundamental political ideology to our opponents and our fellow competitors. But I do get the sense that there is a relishing almost that we're seeing starting to emerge. First of all, it started to creep in around the authoritarianism of the SANDF and the use of the police service and the like. I'm now starting to see it creep in a little bit here around what looks to me like a move to central planning on a grand scale of the economy. What are your views on that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, but I think it's so important then to have, for example, the GA, we're always so vigilant about these slow erosions. And I think sometimes when you have a fairly, and I would say in some measures that is a fairly conservative, and I think actually by looking at what's come out of surveys about adherence to lockdown rules, I think where people have been able to adhere to rules, they have been. So I think we are, by and large, a fairly disciplined society, one that actually wants to go by the rules. And I think when you have that kind of atmosphere, sometimes it's a little bit like a frog in a slowly boiling pot, that people don't recognize what's coming until it's too late. So I think it is important sometimes to have those who are almost one step ahead a little bit and seeing what is happening. And I think we can see that these slow erosions might lead to something far, far more dangerous in the future. Because at the moment, I have seen the argument where some say, well, the truth is we're all at home anyways between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. What's the big fuss? And so I think it's important to say, well, it still needs to be justified why this curfew is being imposed. And also because it's one further grab and you need to be mindful about where that can lead and what other further limitations and restrictions might be imposed without justification.
It's what I've termed previously on the show the danger of the permanence of the temporary, and that many of these things might feel comfortable ideologically for government, and could end up being in place. We're already seeing Bheki Cele saying, well, he'd like the liquor ban extended into the future in perpetuity. We've seen the Minister of Trade and Industry quite relishing being able to pick winners and losers within an industry and to then put them out there. So I mean, this military curfew is a big problem, and we're not in a state of emergency. And I think we've got to guard civil liberties, and I think that's one of the things we've got to be part of. And why do you think it's important to guard these civil liberties?
Well, I mean, I think it can end up resting on your laurels when you do live in what's broadly a democracy and you don't live in a dictatorship. But as always, freedom is not a destination, it's a pursuit. And particularly for our role as a Liberal Party and as the opposition, is to exercise eternal vigilance. And I think that's what we do. And I think that's important, so that we don't find our situation when we're looking back and we realise that it's too late. We've let so much go, and now it's too late to almost walk it back.
Do you think
I think if of power that is grabbed from citizens to government must be explained.
Do you think the pettiness and irrationality and unreasonableness of some of these regulations has the potential to damage that consensus that we've spoken about and what you've spoken about?
Yes, because we absolutely have to trust citizens, and I think ultimately at its core, that's what the social compact is about. Government is given certain powers and authority because citizens trusted to exercise that power and authority in the citizens' interests. And at the moment, where citizens are not being taken into the government's confidence, and we cannot, and it seems like rules are being done in an arbitrary fashion and not linked to any particular outcome. And obviously that becomes concerning because you start to lose the trust and the confidence of the public. And that will also ultimately reduce adherence to any rules and to any lockdown restrictions that were up to this point actually being adhered to. So I think it's ultimately, even besides a civil liberty threat, it's going to become a health threat because any level of adherence that we were seeing was based on trusting that government is conducting itself and putting out rules on behalf and in the public interest. And I think people are starting to doubt whether that in fact is the case.
And I think that's what lies at the heart of us now getting a legal opinion on the military curfew and whether it is actually a valid decision and whether in fact the NCC, which is not cabinet, could had the locus standi to make a military curfew in place. So, I mean, these are issues which we're going to have to traverse. Gwen, we're going to go over to some questions, guys. I think that's a lot of people got a lot of questions. So let's try and get through some of them. Right. We sell our, this from Louise Ann Meinhardt. We sell our cosmetics online using the courier guy to deliver all over South Africa. Is that possible?
From what I've seen in the new regulations, you will be able to sell beauty products, and it's the question of whether you're going to be able to do so on an e-commerce basis. I have a committee meeting, the second attempt now, with Minister Patel tomorrow. So Louise, I just want to tell you that we'll certainly be making that call to him tomorrow to provide absolute clarity on what is and isn't allowed through the e-commerce platform. And we'll look to try and communicate that, John, as well.
Okay, well, there's another question now as well, and it's linked to that. And a lot of people asking about, do you need now a permit still to operate? Do workers need to obtain permits? With the industries as limited as they are that have opened up, are people going to need permits to operate those? How's it going to work?
So I spoke to the CIPC Commissioner, Advocate Rory Fuller, who I just want to say is an amazing South African who's been doing some excellent work under really trying circumstances. He's told me that the permits through the CIPC that have been issued up to date will remain in place. Any industries or businesses that are joining in level 4 will then be able to apply for a permit once those industries have been added to the CIPC. They expect that process to begin later today. He said he was going to message me when the application process was open, so he hasn't done that. So all I want to say is that people can just keep checking on the Biz Portal website. If they just Google Biz Portal, they will find it, and then they will be able to apply for a permit. On the thing that has created much concern for many people is obtaining permits for sole proprietors. That is still something that there is not a lot of clarity around, and much confusion still exists, which creates panic for people. Because they cannot, by the nature of not being registered with the CIPC, apply for that permit. So I really want us to try and come up with a solution tomorrow in tomorrow's committee meeting with Minister Patel, because to just allow the interpretation of whether someone can or cannot operate as a sole proprietor by the SAPS has proved to be a problem up to now and will continue to be so.
Siviwe, a lot of questions here about schools and the health impact of opening schools up again. And Gwen, feel free to come in on this one as well, because I know that we've got a work stream going, particularly on education. Sandy here, can parents legally keep their kids out of school? How do we feel about the reopening of schools?
Yeah, look, I mean, the Western Cape government has come out quite strongly against the opening of schools next week. I think that the stance is not to say that schools should not open at all. The question is the readiness of schools to open, because one of the things that was said earlier this week was that there should be 40 students in a classroom. Now, that would be obviously devastating in terms of being able to practice social distancing. And while children, from a health perspective, that is, may not necessarily be in danger of being being heavily ill from coronavirus, but they can be carriers of the virus back at home, and they can infect their parents, their grandparents, and that can be a problem. And so it's very, very important that if the Department of Education is going to undertake an opening and salvaging the academic year of 2020, which they should, particularly for key grades like grade 7 and grade 12, the academic year must be rescued, but it can't be done at the expense of people's health, at the expense of our communities. And so that's why I think the Department of Education here in the Western Cape has really been cautious about saying that they're ready on the 6th of May.
Gwen, is there anything you want to add on that, or do you feel that covers it?
Well, I think schools, just like the sectors, we are looking to ensure that there's a clear articulation of what the transmission risks are at a school level, and then what the response is to mitigate particular risks. So obviously some risks will be around hygiene, will be around distancing, and it needs to be clear what schools need to do to respond to each particular risk. So I think just with everything that we do, that needs to be kind of the thinking and the approach to these regulations is clear articulation of what the risk is and a clear articulation of what is being done to mitigate that particular risk. And then opening on that basis, so then deciding, is the school ready to adhere to the following protocols or risk mitigation measures that have been put forward? And it's clear the department will also need to explain about how it's going to assist those schools that might not be able to rise up and to meet those particular standards that are required, because schools will have different capabilities in terms of how they can respond to the transmission risks that schools face. And we know that obviously schools that are a bit more resource and financially endowed may be easily able to meet the kind of standards that are required to open out level 4. But what's going to happen to those schools that are less prepared? So that's the kind of detail that we'll be looking for as the Minister announces what the next steps forward are in education.
Right. Thanks for that, Gwen. Siviwe, Roy from Heart FM News asked you to address the 7.5% positive rate in the Western Cape. If it's better targeting, what are the implications for the variable alert levels in future? And I know we've traversed it already, but you just want to maybe talk about that again?
I think it's very, very, the targeted approach is what every single province eventually as a country we should be moving towards. Because ultimately there's 57 million South Africans, and if you don't have a targeted approach in how and who you test, then you are not going to be able, you're going to run out of time, because you're going to be peak, the winter month peak is coming, and if you're not able to have a targeted approach, you're not going to be able to kill those bushfires, as we say, and to kill it at source, and be able to prevent as many people as possible from contracting the virus. And so that is why the Western Cape, I think that approach that they've taken is quite essential in terms of being able to combat the spread.
Great. Thanks. Dean, a lot of stuff around UIF.
Yeah.
Some of the staff got paid, some didn't. Some people put claims and haven't heard anything back yet. It looks like there's a bit of a mess over at UIF.
There's a huge, I think it's now reached a crisis point in the UIF. We know that SARS has intervened, but I think that there's such a delay and backlog in trying to get to that it's becoming a bigger problem by the day. I think what we're also starting to worry about is also the cash pool that's available to the UIF. They took a big hit after the markets turned negative with the advent of the coronavirus in South Africa. They're exposed heavily on the JSE and have lost quite a bit of money. But I know that my colleague Michael Cardo and Michael Bagram, who many people have heard of through his famous WhatsApp videos, are really working every day to try and resolve it. But the crux of the matter is, for every day that this drags on and someone is not being paid or a business is not getting the money for their employees, the closer that is to that business meeting its end is.
Yeah.
So there's got to be a huge intervention by government. And so instead of them worrying about sort of what time people are exercising and sort of what percentages manufacturers are opening. Maybe they should actually concentrate all of their efforts into actually getting cash into people's hands who desperately need it at the moment to keep their business open.
Yeah. Controversial one for you, Siviwe, and you put out a statement about it yesterday. I hope William Saunderson Mayer saw it. Why are Cuban doctors here? And when our doctors are sitting at home, there's something fishy.
So we did issue a statement yesterday following us submitting parliamentary questions on this, because while obviously I have to make it quite clear, John, that every assistance in any way is welcome in a global pandemic. We know that our health system requires that kind of assistance, and any bolstering of our efforts is welcome. However, it is unclear to us as to why whether or not a skills audit in the country was done to ascertain whether or not the special skills that these Cuban doctors are said to be bringing are in fact missing from our current cohort of specialists. We have a whole depth of healthcare professionals in the country, some of whom are unemployed, some of whom are in really specialized fields. And so it was important for us that, has government done an audit to figure out whether or not we can't deploy people to specific areas, people in this country to be able to be at the forefront of this response. It was very disturbing to also hear from some of the organized bodies saying they haven't even been consulted by government, which then begs the question, how was the skills audit done? Was government in touch with any of the medical professionals bodies to find out exactly whether any of their members are able to free themselves? Some of the GPs who are no longer operating under the lockdown, some of those people can be specialists that can be deployed in specific areas. So while we're not simply saying that we reject any aid, but we're saying that there is aid available in this country, and we should be focusing on using our own healthcare professionals. And then the other part is the cost. I think a lot of people
think this is free.
People think this is foreign aid, and this is coming at a cost. The cost that has been flouted is about 440 million rand. Now the question is, is that a good use of our limited resources? Because we don't have infinite resources. Is that a good use of our resources? Can that money be better placed in investing in the current capacity that we have in the country? Can those resources be targeted towards testing, tracing, and tracking? And so these are the questions, and it was never clear because, again, the issue around buy-in from South Africans, the minister did, say nobody was going to be unemployed, no doctor was going to, or nurse, or any healthcare professional was going to be taken out of a job. But there still is no explanation on the rationale behind getting healthcare professionals from another country at such a cost, and who's going to foot the bill?
Carla here, what is required to travel once off to another province to get back home? Well, I think that was announced last night that you can travel, but it's a one-way destination only. So don't buy any return tickets. Kayla, you can go home, but and you are allowed to do so, but you won't be able to return back to where you wanted to come from. Lucretia, is it true that police are allowed to raid our homes without a warrant? No. The Bill of Rights is still intact. The Criminal Procedure Act is still intact. No police officer can enter your house without a warrant. Gwen, I'm going to end with you, if I may. BEE, and we've spoken about our court case and that. Do you want to take Coronacast views why we are taking this so seriously, and particularly challenging the use of BEE as a requirement for disaster aid?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's important that in a situation like this, that we are mindful that everyone is in need of assistance, and that the assistance in particular is directed at those who are in need. And I think to further introduce other subjective criteria as to who amongst those in need should receive assistance and who shouldn't is obviously generally problematic, but it's even more problematic when you're actually in a disaster situation and you are confronted with the crisis, where the only real concern is about lifting and trying to support as many South Africans as possible. So I don't think the question should be whether, that we are concerned with a particular demographic or group within society that requires that assistance. It really should just be based on the kind of business support that government is trying to provide and ensuring that we are protecting as much employment and jobs as possible. I think that's really the criteria, that we also need to be sure that we don't end up cutting off our noses to spite our face, and that it's not so clear-cut in a scenario like this, where there will be many Black South Africans who work potentially for a white-owned small business, and who might then suffer the consequences of that particular business owner not receiving the kind of business relief and assistance that is necessary.
Yeah.
So I think now really is the time for all of us to stand in solidarity with one another, for a kind of whole of society approach, and it's not the time to be using this opportunity to be divisive and to divide South Africans, which I think is...
Yeah. I think especially when the president's asked us all to work together, I think that's the thing that's really upset a lot of people. We all got behind this thing to beat the virus, and now people are being cherry-picked. Well, Gwen, Siviwe, and Dean, thank you very much for being on the special edition of Coronacast.
I just want to say, John, tomorrow at 9 o'clock, the Train Industry Committee is going to be meeting. You can
on Workers' Day.
Yeah, on Workers' Day.
Wow.
You can join us by the Parliamentary YouTube channel, and there you'll be able to see exactly the great recommendations and the hard work that we're putting in Parliament, and what we're looking to achieve on behalf of South Africans. So please join in.
Thank you, and you heard that. Siviwe, thank you very much. Gwen, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be seeing lots more of you guys on Coronacast going forward. Well, folks, that's all we've got time for this week. I hope you found it informative, and thank you very much for submitting those questions through. It's always great to hear from you. And remember, you can keep sending those questions through to us at our email address, coronavirus@da.org.za. It's our line where you're able to send things through. Remember as well, if you've missed something important on this particular part of the show, you want to go back and look at an episode, there's a piece of information you require, our dedicated website, www.da.org.za/defeating coronavirus. Remember too, you can send through to our various hotlines. All of the numbers are available on our website. Remember too, South Africans, get a cloth mask. It's very important we wear cloth masks wherever we are. We practice hygiene and we abide by the regulations. My special shout out this week goes to the DA councillors in the city of Tshwane. Yesterday we got the great news that we had won the court case that had essentially placed that under administration by the provincial government, and the provincial government were prevented from taking power in Tshwane through the back door instead of actually getting an electoral mandate. I'm really proud of our team of DA councillors in Tshwane for this particular reason. That they weren't paid salaries. The council was unlawfully put under administration. They weren't paid salaries, but they carried on working all through this virus for the people that had elected them in Tshwane. They carried on dealing with residents, assisting with access to food banks and food parcels, and assisting where they could, and being on hand to share information with residents. So my shout out this week goes to all of our great DA councillors in the city of Tshwane. We're very proud of you as a party. Well, that's all we've got time for today. We'll see you next week, Tuesday, same time, same place. That's 2 p.m. on our Facebook and Twitter feed. Keep your questions coming through, and we'll hope we'll be able to keep you informed going forward. For all of you workers out there, for all of those people who are still working, happy Workers' Day tomorrow. May it be a day in which I think we appreciate work and the ability to be able to have a job when so many people do not. And we appreciate that even more on a day like Workers' Day. So for all the workers out there, thank you for what you're doing to make South Africa, and especially our frontline healthcare workers who are at the front line in terms of defeating the coronavirus in South Africa. Stay safe out there, South Africa. We're going to get through this together. We'll see you next week.